Well, welcome again to the Straight Truth Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Philpot, and as always, I'm joined by Pastor Richard Caldwell, the pastor of Founders Baptist Church and also president of Walking in Grace Ministries. Now, for this season of Straight Truth, we have three special guests that are joining us. First, we have Dr. Bruce Ware, professor of Christian theology at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and also Dr. Tom Schreiner, also professor of New Testament at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And these two brothers are pastors and elders at Clifton Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. Lastly, we're joined by Pastor Mike Fabarez, pastor of Compass Bible Church in Southern California. Now, as always, please leave us a comment on social media or on YouTube and let us know what you're thinking about as we discuss these important issues. Bruce, last night you spoke about the incomparable holiness of God. It was very, very helpful, the absolute separateness of God from everything else, and especially all that he has made, even though some of his creatures are called holy. I'm thinking, and specifically you mentioned Isaiah 6 and the seraphim who fly around the throne of God and say, holy, holy, holy. There's a holiness that they have. And even we look forward to a holiness, the new heaven and new earth, when we're with God in Christ and we reflect him in a holy way. But I think what you said was interesting and caused me to reflect. Is there a sort of holiness that God's creatures possess that is different than the holiness of God?
Mm-hmm. Yes. The answer is yes. That holiness in God is distinctive from even the best of holiness in creatures, which would be, I think, exhibited in the seraphim, mm-hmm. and of course in the holiness we will have as we are remade into the image of Christ fully in the new creation. But the holiness of God, you can think of categories of intrinsic versus derivative. Okay. So our holiness, and the best that we have, is derivative. Derived from whom? Mm-hmm. From God, who grants to us what he doesn't grant to elephants and tigers and mm-hmm. trees and rocks, but he grants to his moral creatures this quality of moral awareness, and through that the ability to live life in a morally pure way. Mm. So holiness, as we would think of that. But that's derivative in us, only because God granted it to us. But who gave it to God? Mm-hmm. Well, it's his by nature, so it's intrinsic mm-hmm. in God. All of the attributes of God are infinite in their fullness. There's no limitation, no boundary or restriction in any of the attributes of God. And yet we have restrictions in every quality that we have. Mm-hmm. Your holiness is yours, mine is mine. Mm-hmm. And there's just, it's hard to quantify what this is, but it's a restricted concept as opposed to what is unrestricted and infinite in God. Mm-hmm. So finite versus infinite is another category. God's holiness is one in which he possesses in himself eternally, whereas ours begins at a particular point. Mm-hmm. So this is another way in which his holiness is distinctive, qualitatively distinctive, because it is eternally his.
I wonder, I heard you speak, I remember the first semester I was in seminary, yeah. mm-hmm. about the holiness of God. And I wonder if you can just mention a little bit who has really influenced you in thinking about this and also writing about it and dwelling on this and teaching about it. You had mentioned in that talk, my first semester in seminary, about A.W. Tozer, mm-hmm. and that first sentence that's so famous in his book, The Knowledge of the Holy. Maybe you could just speak a little bit about that.
Well, yes, Tozer, the Lord used Tozer in my life at a very critical time, my freshman year of college, and okay. I was seeking to know whether the God of my parents, the God of my upbringing, was the true God, and whether I should follow him. And through that process of searching, God put into my hands a copy of The Knowledge of the Holy. Mm-hmm. And that book absolutely revolutionized my conception of God in seeing him as big and glorious, as exalted, self-sufficient, and as holy. So both the sense of his transcendent greatness as well as his purity, mm-hmm. It is astonishing, really an amazing thing to behold. Mm-hmm. And so that impacted me much. R.C. Sproul, of course, has written a lot on this, but honestly, people in the Reformed tradition, you know, from recent ones, Packer, Piper, Sproul, and then older ones, Charnock and Turretin and others, you know, have highlighted the centrality of the holiness of God. That really, I heard Carson say this years ago, and I think it's absolutely right, that the holiness of God really does describe the godness of God, what constitutes God as God, because He's separate from everything else that exists as the uncreated. I think maybe that was the fourth category. Uncreated as opposed to created. So, yeah.
Holiness means what exactly in the Bible?
Yeah, the root meaning of it is to be separated from, or to be set apart, to be distinctive. And that's why it can be applied to things like a Sabbath day. Why is that holy? Well, it's not a moral category. It's a category of separate from the other 6 days, and a number of other ways in which you see that. But then that notion of separateness applies very, very importantly to moral separation from all that is impure, all that is unclean in our lives. Yeah.
If the eternal Son of God is holy, Paul has this statement in Philippians 2 that He emptied Himself.
Yes.
Did Jesus in the incarnation empty Himself of any of His holiness in the incarnation?
Absolutely not. So that term in Philippians 2 verse 6 does not say that He emptied something out of Himself. It says He poured Himself out, or He emptied Himself, the whole of who He is, with all of His deity, including His holiness, including His omniscience, His omnipotence. I mean, the whole of who He is poured out, taking the form of a bondservant. So it's really an emptying by adding to Himself humanity. And of course, as that happens, then we realize there are two natures that are involved in the one person of Christ. And as He lives His life through His human nature, He experiences the limitations of human life. He has to grow in wisdom. He doesn't know the hour of the second coming. Mark 13:32 and many other examples. He gets tired and thirsty and hungry and so on. And yet, as God, He has unlimited capacities. He upholds the universe together by the word of His power while He's a baby in the manger. It's just an amazing thing to realize. Because of two natures, he lives authentically through each of those natures in accomplishing all that He is to do, respectively, as the eternal Son of the Father and as the Son of David, the Messiah.
Hey Bruce, how important would you say it is, our understanding of God's holiness, to our learning holiness in our own lives, living it out? How important is the knowledge of God's holiness to the production of holiness in the believer's life?
Well, at least two things come to my mind. I'm sure you no doubt have an answer in mind as you're asking that, but two things come to my mind. One is by example. So we see the holiness of God, the holiness of Christ as He lives His life, and we see in that the way we're called to live as those created in the image of God and being remade in the image of Christ. That's the standard, right, that we look at. And as we talked about earlier, this is not only the standard of moral purity, but of true fulfillment, true human flourishing is found as we live that way. But the other thing that comes to my mind is the realization that we can't make this happen in us. So it has to be the work of God by His Spirit in us to do this restructuring of our nature, so that we, in the end, live in a way that is fully in keeping with God's own standards of holiness.
I thought what you shared last night was outstanding, and I'm thinking now in terms of admiration and worship. To understand that my holiness has a beginning.
Yeah.
God's had no beginning.
Yeah.
My holiness is a gift. It's given to me, produced by God. God's holiness was not given to Him. Whatever holiness I have is sustained by God.
Yes.
I can't sustain it in my own strength.
Right.
No one sustains holiness in God.
That's right.
Whatever holiness I possess has limits. It's not infinite in nature. Whatever God possesses is infinite in nature. To understand that derivative nature of even a holiness that has been sustained for the entire existence of a creature, such as in holy angels, that still makes God's holiness absolutely distinct.
Yeah.
I just thought it was a powerful point you made last night and very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, it is. I mean, God's amazing. He just is. And we and our people both need to see better how incredible God is.
Amen.
Yeah.
So I shift a little bit in this discussion of holiness. If God is all holy, which means that he is also righteous and just, and he's also a God of love, Tom, why would God send people to hell if God is awesome and holy, but also a God of eternal love?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say is, since God is awesomely holy, infinitely holy, perfectly holy, sin can't abide in his presence.
Yeah.
So God cannot tolerate sin. If God tolerated sin, he'd cease to be God. What it means to be God is that sin is separate from him. Of course, it's true. God, I don't think holiness and love in God are in conflict. I don't think in an orthodox position is the attributes conflict with one another. But Romans 3:21 and 26 is a beautiful passage, isn't it? That God has sent his Son, Jesus Christ, who willingly and gladly came. God sent him in his love to be the propitiation, to propitiate, I should say, God's wrath, so that God's holiness is upheld, but also his love is demonstrated at the cross. So God's mercy, love, and grace are demonstrated at the cross, but also his justice. Christ took upon himself the wrath of God, because God, not all theologians agree with this, but I think this is right. God cannot forgive without his justice being satisfied. That doesn't mean there's a law above God, because holiness is intrinsic to God's nature. So God's justice must be satisfied, but at the cross, he also demonstrates his love. Love and holiness come together at the cross.
How is it possible to describe God's love as holy love?
Yes.
So there's a sense in which holiness is the largest of the categories, if I could say it that way.
Yeah.
And his love then is holy love and holy justice and holy mercy.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Only a sinner would sincerely ask that question, though, right? If God is loving, how can he send people to hell? I mean, even in the sensibilities of the normal citizen of our city or our county, if I were running to be a judge in this county, if my platform was, if you vote for me, everyone will go free. No one will go to jail. No one would vote for me. I'm not a good judge if I don't have a sense of justice. And see, it's all the good law-abiding citizens that want the judge to be just, right? So we're all sinners, and we know that. So we'd like God somehow not to send anyone to jail.
That's good. No, that's a good illustration.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks again for joining us for the Straight Truth Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Now, you can find links to all of our social media channels by going to our website, straighttruth.net. Now, do us a favor. Please go to our YouTube channel and subscribe to these episodes there. We release new episodes every Thursday. Also, go to the iTunes podcast section and leave us a review. Now, Straight Truth is a production of Walking in Grace Ministries. For more information, go to walkingingrace.org.